I want to open with just a brief discussion of what Old Testament theology is within the context of the discipline of biblical theology. Just like anything, definitions matter and categories are important in terms of study. And the discipline of biblical theology has undergone rampant transformation during the second half of the 20th century and the first decade or so of the 21st century. And biblical theology is a discipline that has been contested. It's something that is undergoing much renovation and a lot of lively debate. And so when you entered into a course in Old Testament theology, you probably didn't realize that the topic was something that was so contested and so lively. So I want us to just unpack a few things in terms of definitions. Brevard Childs talked about a stalemate in terms of the discipline. This was back in the 1970s and 80s. And in the 90s, Will Perdue talked about the discipline of biblical theology kind of like a Tower of Babel with all kinds of dissenting voices that no one can really understand and no one's really talking to one another. They're talking past one another because of the difference in languages, using that analogy of the Tower of Babel. Ryberry said that the search for biblical theology is like a search for a mythical beast, and no one can even agree on what that beast is or what that beast looks like. So, as always, there are complexities in terms of disciplines when it comes to study of the Bible. James Barr has a quote that I'd like to just share with you here. Let me kind of minimize my talking head here a little bit. He says, if there's any theme that runs through the work, it is the contested character of biblical theology, as it has been in this century. He's writing, of course, in the 20th century. Biblical theology has its enthusiasts who cannot understand why anyone would question its validity as a subject. It's also had its opponents, some of whom consider it to be impractical as an area of research, or unacceptable as an academic subject, or useless to the religious community, or all of these three. It is my belief that these elements of opposition have to be faced and understood, and that the understanding of them may paradoxically assist in the continuance and future prosperity of biblical theology, or something like it. And it's that last phrase, or something like it, that raises the eyebrows when we think of Barr's contention that the discipline of biblical theology is that of a contested study and enterprise. So that's kind of what we're getting into in this topic. It's kind of like a sculptor who just kind of quips when someone asks, how do you make such an exquisite display of art out of a piece of stone? And the sculptor just kind of whimsically says, oh, well, I just take everything away that doesn't look like what this object of my art is, and everything that is cut away is not part of it, and what ends up is the statue that I'm really trying to create. So biblical theology is more than just what it is not, but I do think that we should talk about terminology just for a moment in this introductory lecture. So biblical theology is not exegesis. Exegesis is the systematic exploration of a particular passage in its historical and its cultural context, paying close attention to its canonical setting in the Bible. And so exegesis is a discipline all its own, and in our context here at our institution, we have an entire course on biblical interpretation that introduces the subject of exegesis and hermeneutics. Nor is biblical theology systematic theology or dogmatic theology. Typically with systematic theology, you have at least four categories that, to be honest, are imposed on the biblical text, where these categories of God, humanity, sin, God's people, eschatology, usually these five areas are what comes up in terms of systematic theology. And as you know, the Bible is not organized systematically, does not have categories of God, humanity, sin, salvation, God's people, eschatology. What it has are its own categories and its own way of looking at things. So biblical theology is not systematic theology, nor is it the non-theological study of the Bible. Some people have just thrown their hands up and said, you know, the Bible is such a complex work with so many diverse voices that you cannot come up with what the Bible is teaching about God. Some have questioned just the very nature of that enterprise, where biblical theology is not nearly as pessimistic in terms of the outcome of their enterprise. Nor is it approach from the history of religions, where you look at how it is that religion developed in terms of humanity, and you look at various cultural expressions of religious forms and the cult in which religion is practiced according to various proponents of religion, and you compare those and contrast those across cultures. So biblical theology is neither of these four disciplines: exegesis, systematic, non-theological study, or a history of religions approach. But let's not just define biblical theology in terms of what it is not. What is it? So biblical theology and Old Testament theology is a sub-discipline under biblical theology. Biblical theology is an exploration and investigation of themes that arise directly from the Bible. Okay? These are biblical rather than philosophical categories. So rather than a philosophical category of salvation, we look at what categories come in terms of the language of the Bible itself. So it's an exploration, investigation of themes that arise directly from the Bible. Now, these themes often overlap with these broader systematic categories from systematic theology or dogmatic theology. But in many ways, these themes can be different. For example, in the Old Testament, one of the categories might be to do some research on the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh. That's a category that arises directly from the biblical text. It's also a midpoint between exegesis and systematic theology. So exegesis is the exploration of that specific text. Systematic theology is that broad, overarching, philosophical, categorical approach to the study of theology. And biblical theology is that point in between. Old Testament theology is one example of biblical theology. So is New Testament theology. But you might also talk about the theology of Paul as a category of biblical theology, or the theology of John in the New Testament. Or you could even talk about the category of the Old Testament prophets as a category of theological exploration. Or a person could look at something of the theology of the Torah or the Pentateuch. These are all examples of Old Testament theology. I like what Elmer Martin says about this. He says that biblical theology is to the health of the church what the Center for Disease Control in the USA is to a nation's health. Just as the Center for Disease Control monitors trends and offers directives to the public, so biblical theology serves as a resource whereby the church can do a reality check to ensure that the faith community is not aberrant or one-sided in its beliefs. Norms for belief and behavior are important for the church in whose service the discipline of biblical theology is placed. So in this course of Old Testament theology is a subset of this larger discipline of biblical theology, which is kind of a midway point between exegesis and systematic theology. And it's also very practical in that biblical theology is a monitoring device that can be useful for service of the church and ministry. We'll be looking in our next lecture at 5 challenges to this notion of biblical theology. And I know when you signed up for this course, you probably didn't realize that it would be so technical at the beginning. But as I said, definitions matter. And the category of Old Testament theology or biblical theology is a very specific discipline with specific norms, even though it's had such a contentious history in the past.